Welcome to the Climate and Coordination RCAST, where every week we'll be discussing topics related to all things climate change and RChain's role in the solution. We will be discussing technologies that can adapt and coordinate massive amounts of data like never before, forming social architectures that grow collective intelligence, sharing and evaluating data planetarily, all while maintaining personal privacy and personal data ownership. A new decentralized economy is forming as we move from the third industrial revolution, digitization, to the fourth, decarbonization. By building a co-op, built on a correct by construction, concurrent, scalable solution, RChain is structured to build out the new technology that will be required for a flourishing regenerative planet. Please join us on this journey.
Okay, so good morning, and thank you to everyone who's joining the RChain RCAST, the Climate and Coordination RCAST today. And I guess Daryl will take it away from here because we have a very special guest today, and we're very happy to have him.
All right, yeah. So today we're going to start off the talk more about the coordination side of things as opposed to the climate side of things. Of course, they're both and all ultimately interconnected. Basically a few weeks ago, I read an article that I thought just really nailed it, and it nailed it in a way that came from an angle that I hadn't quite seen yet. The article is called, "Think a Privacy Law Will Stop Surveillance Capitalism? You Don't Know Google." So, as you probably all know, I am a big Shoshana Zuboff fan, and I've come to realize that surveillance capitalism has become one of the biggest problems we have to confront as a society. So seeing the term surveillance capitalism instantly piqued my interest. It's a major problem that must be confronted, and I believe will be best confronted with the Buckminster-Fuller approach, that if you want to change something, rather than fighting the existing reality, we can develop something new to make the existing reality obsolete. But this will be very difficult, as surveillance capitalism has replaced the oil industry as the most powerful industry in today's world. As I've also mentioned before, the peace negotiator Johan Galtung identifies that empires rise and fall around an energy source. The Romans and the Egyptians had humans as their main energy source. The Dutch had wind. The British had coal. And the US empire was built around oil. But now the biggest companies in the world are data companies. We're back to humans as the energy source. And our data is being mined as a freely accessible resource. So in this excellent article, Alex McDougall rightly and lucidly points out something that I think many are missing. That more privacy, and I quote, "more privacy without fixing the underlying paradigm isn't what we need." So I'm normally a kind of timid person when it comes to making new introductions with people that I don't know. But this one really spoke to me. So I actually reached out and emailed the author. I literally never do that. And he actually responded. So today I'm very excited to report that Alex has joined us on the call. Welcome, Alex, and thank you for taking the time to talk with us today.
No problem, Daryl. Thanks a lot for having me. I know it's been a little bit of a back and forth to get this working in this wild, crazy world that we live in. And it was a ton of fun writing that article. I mean, we've been talking about this type of stuff for a year, 2 years now, ever since we started my venture platform. It's not even really a venture fund, called Bicameral Ventures. And so a lot of the time it's got an audience. There's some people who are interested in it, this whole idea of self-sovereignty and the paradigms that we'll talk about in a minute. But what I've found in the last month especially is that as our digital personas become our only personas, as we're all sitting around in our respective little bubbles in the world, and the only way we can coordinate is virtually, this type of discussion about the underlying data paradigm has become sort of priority number one for people. We no longer have public spaces where we can meet and do our highest value interactions. We don't have places we can close deals. We don't have places we can tell secrets. Everything we do, even this conversation right now, is heavily intermediated. And it's always been sort of like that to a certain extent, but we always had this outlet of in-person ability to talk and communicate and interact with each other, and we just don't anymore. And so it's really high time that there's been these slow evolving trends. And you mentioned Shoshana Zuboff and her weighty tome, Surveillance Capitalism. And those have been the trends for, I would say, at least 15 or 20 years now, ever since Google created the data for services model that is essentially the driving force that powers like 80% of our commerce today. But those forces and trends have kind of, by design, festered in the background. I mean, we only ever see 10% maybe of what's really happening in our digital world, and that might even be too much, given that literally our entire world, as you mentioned, runs on the other 90% that sits on the back end. We have a stunningly low amount of visibility into what's actually happening back there. So now I'm actually on a podcast later this afternoon with the Consensus Distributed folks, to talk about our data trails and this way that we're moving through the world and what we're leaving behind, our crumbs. Google called it digital exhaust back in the day in an attempt to sort of minimize it and say, hey, it doesn't matter. Don't worry about that stuff. That was kind of in like the 2008 era before we really recognized how valuable all of this stuff was. But it's essentially we've come to sort of a head on this where we're all vaguely aware that there's more than meets the eye. We're all starting to use tools like Zoom on a minutely basis. We're all starting to really dive in a little bit and understand more about what our digital persona is, because it's our only persona. And so a lot of these discussions are coming to a peak, and really a lot of it is around the recent pandemic as well, of how we're using this data in order to fight this pandemic. And we can get into a bunch of that stuff later, because I've got a lot of thoughts on how we're doing it so far, what countries are doing, how we can do it private sector, public sector, and most importantly, how we can leverage technology to get the best of all these worlds. So there's a ton of places we can dig into. But I think in general, the paradigm that I'm writing about in that article is this idea of, right now, your digital persona is being created by other people on your behalf / without your knowledge and behind the scenes. And so whether it's Google or Facebook or Amazon or any of sort of the big data brokers, I mean, if you go to essentially any website and dig up a tracker visibility app like Ghostery or Lockdown or anything like that, there's 5 trackers that you see every single place that you go. DoubleClick, which is Google, Facebook, Chartbeat, Beacon Scorecard. All of those are essentially these people building digital personas of us behind the scenes, which we have absolutely no visibility into. And the fact that there's no graphical user interface, there's essentially no programs or platforms that we can even have any idea what that looks like, yet that's the resource that's powering 80% of our economy, is a absolutely shattered paradigm. So when I'm talking about privacy laws, which is one of the things that I was diving into in that article, I mean, I don't think the answer, especially in our current world where we're relying on these digital vehicles to even have any modicum of human connectivity, the answer to that isn't shutting off those data feeds. I mean, if we're relying on everybody to say, hey, no longer monetize data, we lose every single tool we have. I mean, that's just a fact. Some of us can operate in a private world, but if everybody starts leveraging Tor and the better data platforms and actually practicing data self-sovereignty via the vehicles that are available to us now, all of our vehicles go away. There isn't really like a back end to that right now. So that's the paradigm that I'm talking about, is we need better vehicles to make a better way to connect in a way that allows us to accrue data to ourselves, not for the purposes of privacy, but for the purposes of creating better connectivity, better connective landscape, and better self-sovereignty for ourselves. Awesome. It's so great to speak with you finally. And just, you have such a lucid way of your perspective is just, to me, it's just spot on. And
I really appreciate that. One thing I've noticed you mention as I've kind of been investigating you, kind of stalking you, is you kind of talk about the whole idea of control of identity to the individual, and how the individual can kind of choose to release that control in various ways, and the kind of the way this could evolve in such a way that kind of respects individual rights a little bit better.
Yeah, no, it's and to your point with what you said earlier of the Buckminster Fuller approach of creating new paradigms and building new technology to just be the natural evolution or the natural design into something that's completely different. That's really the way we approach everything that we look at, both myself and from a Bicameral Ventures perspective, is we're starting today. We're not starting in this fictional future where everybody is a computer programmer and everybody has extreme tech abilities, everybody's an early adopter, everybody has 100-year time horizons. We're starting in today, our world of nobody has any time until right now, which is a huge, weird, messy opportunity, but nobody has any time. Most people don't understand what the hell their technology does. There's weird regulations that all conflict with each other. Everything's massively politicized. We generally sort of, I think people think about it as laziness. I think about it as the path of least resistance. And most people, the system is too complicated and too big for us to actually figure out our proper place in it. So we go with whatever's easiest, and oftentimes Google is easiest. It's designed to be incredibly functional and impactful. And so it's when we're looking at evolving these paradigms, it's evolving from what we have today into this sort of futuristic world. And so I think about it in a couple of different steps. And so step number one is the existing data feeds and the existing data vehicles that are going out and leaving us. Start taking those feeds. So you can access your Google profile, you can access your Facebook profile, you can see the weird .csv file that has all of it. It means nothing to individuals unless you're a programmer. But you can access that stuff. So let's start building vehicles that actually allow us to go to Google and say, hey, give me my shit. To go to Facebook and say, hey, give me my shit. Go to LinkedIn and take that. Go to your Google Maps and take your mobility profile. Go to Uber and take your rides. Start bringing all of that together and start creating this 360-degree profile of you. And have it based on the edge, whether we're using distributed file storage. I mean, in the initial world, it's probably going to be cloud-based still, because you can't jump too many leaps in a row. But make it essentially as easy as, here's an app, here's the 5 things you need to connect to start building this, and then have a really cool, slick digital interface that shows some basic linkages between your buying habits and where you've traveled. Just stuff that is sort of basic trade and fodder for surveillance capitalists on the back end today. Just like start showing me a few of those things. Make a search engine where I can actually see which Facebook thing I liked that is driving this specific search result. Just things like that that start establishing a very basic supply chain of data. Like those are the sort of things that it's like, okay, I can now see, I have a little bit deeper view under the veil of what's actually happening with my digital persona here.
By the way, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I want to
please
mention that one of the sometimes very active and vocal members of RChain, Jacob Basiri, has been pursuing a similar idea. He has an offering called Wally, which is essentially a data wallet to make most of this explicit and to put it back into the hands of ordinary consumers.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And totally agree. There's a bunch of really cool projects doing version 1 of this. So one of our investments is something called MetaMe with Dalio, who's based out of New York, who's actually part of this conference I was at earlier today, because you can go to 5 conferences in a day when everything's virtual. But it's a similar idea of a single sign-on mechanism that starts accumulating all of the data that you have in various places to you, makes it visual, and then makes it functional. And so by functional, I mean, okay, what can I actually do with this data? In the simplest, the bare bones version of it is sell it. And I think that's, people look at and say, hey, the data's power, the value of the data business is whatever, $80 billion, or probably way higher than that, actually. I mean, we look at the total economic loss caused by data issues in the 2 trillion range, but that's sort of a wider array of things. But okay, well, if it's that valuable, then maybe I should be able to sell it. Yes, but in today's world, the value of an individual's piece of data is not that high as raw data going out the door. I think it's much more powerful to allow people and give people vehicles to actually use that data for something that's functional. So I mean, the example that we use with this MetaMe project that we're invested in is essentially you take your basic personal information, you take your some things that you manually enter, like the type of car, your age, and you take a little bit about your driving history that you manually enter as well. So you put that all into this personal data vault that sits within you. And this is where a little bit more of the blockchain angle comes in. You create effectively a non-fungible token out of that. So it's this non-fungible data asset that goes out, and a bunch of insurance companies look at that via a data transmission protocol, look at that non-fungible asset, consume it in a private execution environment, and then come back with quotes that are incredibly personally tailored to you, but without ever actually seeing your personal information on the other side. So it's this idea of all of this data accrues to you. You can share it via these trusted execution vehicles, and you can essentially get the benefit of these next generation data paradigms without actually seeing, or without actually sharing that information directly. Now, again, that's taking a few steps farther down the line as well. But in sort of the general version of the roadmap is using data that exists today to accrue back to you. And again, there's a few different technologies doing that, showing people that it's interesting and cool and has value, because most people don't even acknowledge that they have a data profile today. And then continuing on in terms of how you share that data, ideally first for money, because that's probably the simplest way to do it. The other aspect of that is the instituting a minimum data share requirement. And again, these are things that can be built into protocols for sharing. The example, I'm sure you guys have heard this before, with blockchain people have told it for a while, of going to a club and needing to show your ID card to the bouncer. All they need to know is that you are of the right age to get into that. But when you show them your ID card, they get your address, your eye color, your hair color, your driver's license number, a bunch of stuff that they don't need to do that specific purpose. So the idea of the minimum data share is just the date, and that's it. They know that it's valid, they know that it's the right idea, but they only see the date, and that's it. And the even further and better version of that is that they don't actually see the date, they just get a check mark that says this guy's of age. And that's really that private execution environment. Zero knowledge proofs in certain situations, but it's more zero knowledge proving of different pieces of data. So those are sort of the back end pieces of it. What that looks like on the front end to consumers is a little bit different, and finding vehicles to find where consumers are today, whether it's within browser extensions. There's a really interesting platform called Loginhood that's starting to do some interesting things around that side. Again, the project we talked about, MetaMe, we're working with another project called Velocia that's working, I mean, it's mobility, so it's very challenging now, but it's working with the city of Miami to connect all of your various different multimodal ways of getting around the city. So your metro, your scooter company, your Google Health, your Google Fit, and essentially create a mobility profile of a data sense for you as a user, and tie it to carbon that you've saved, cars you've taken off the road, and reward you for specific behaviors. So all of these sort of ideas of changing it from Uber has all my data to I have my data, I have my Uber data, I have my Metro data, I have my health data, I have my Fit data. And then the last thing I want to say on this is sort of the secret weapon to all of this, because it seems really, really hard to take down Google because it's so well entrenched, is that shared and connected and correlated data is exponentially more valuable than extracted and surveilled data. And I think that's really the secret sauce of all of this stuff. Google can surveil you for a year and generate a profile, but that profile pales in comparison to one fully engaged 15-minute actual truthful survey, well designed with somebody. And that's really, we just need to create the vehicles by which people in their lizard brains going down the path of least resistance are actually willing to engage on those surveys, or willing to engage in this idea of shared data versus extracted data.
I wanted to say something that I thought of. I was just watching the news yesterday, unfortunately, and it was MSNBC, also semi-unfortunately. And not to get too political into this, but I thought it was so interesting. Chris Hayes was asking Nancy Pelosi, well, why don't you guys just have congressional meetings on Zoom? Why can't you guys just meet, when you're, on leave, I guess, during the coronavirus? Like, obviously there's a lot they need to do. And she said, well, Zoom is a Chinese company. We're not even sure if they are going to be able to have access to our very private information. And Chris was taken aback by this, oh yeah, duh. I haven't even thought about the fact that it's really not a secure place for the United States Congress to be conducting,
Totally.
Potentially classified business. So that was really surprising to me. I just heard that yesterday. So this is very in my head.
And there's this kind of dual aspect to that. And that's a super good point, that people who are in the know and actively driving the narrative on this conversation have no idea. And that's, that's fine. It's sort of a reflective of our society, where there's an emerging problem that's coming to a head now. But there's sort of two things, and I feel like people really get lost in the malicious actor hacks or vulnerabilities. So Zoom links, people coming on and cracking your Zoom, or somebody released a pretty detailed walkthrough of how you could rootkit somebody's Mac via Zoom. And so those types of straight up malicious actors, and that's really what even gets the headlines. But I mean, what is more nefarious to me is the actual business model of Zoom. I mean, none of us are paying for this. Or maybe you guys might have a corporate account. So, but the vast majority of people on Zoom aren't paying for it. And just the acceptance is yeah, that makes sense. No, that doesn't make sense as a business model. So, I mean, if you actually look in the background of their privacy statement or their privacy policies, they're not great. And I don't think that's much of a surprise. When you share your screen, it indexes everything you have open and looks at that and creates a profile of you, and then works with advertisers to develop all of that. All of the information that you have on the back end of your computer right now, Zoom is looking into, because it needs to have the ability to see what you have open, so you can share a specific screen instead of just all of your screen. So and then within their privacy statement, they state that they do things with that data. And that's even when you get data privacy or security people looking at that, they're oh yeah, that's okay. But I think that's actually the bigger problem is the legitimacy of that, all of your data for this relatively basic service, and that business model entirely. And I think there's, again, I said this at the start, but there's ways to protect your privacy, and there's ways to operate in a private manner, even within sort of the most extractive platforms that we have today. But if everybody gets the right digital quota of intelligence and does that, then we don't have those platforms. And that's really where the paradigm shift needs to happen, I think.
So therefore the race is on. This COVID thing has accelerated this race to kind of come up with an alternative to Zoom. What do you think the opportunities are there, and how do you think this race could unfold right now?
So that's a fascinating question, and I think I wish we were 2 years, 3 years farther ahead in the whole blockchain world when this happened, because we're still in sort of the I hate to say it, but the hack and slash mode of blockchain projects that are actually out there. This is going to be a UX battle, pure and simple. It needs to be visceral value propositions that my grandma cares about, without any negatives in the UX department. We always look at it in terms of we need to hold UX constant, and then add new features and add new technologies as you can step up the actual value proposition back to the user. So faster, more tailored, more incentivized, cooler features, better recommendations. All of those are things that people tangibly care about. They don't give a shit what's powering it on the back end. So, but you can't go from Google level UX to whatever we have on blockchain right now and say like, oh, but look at all this cool stuff you can do, because people just don't care. And that's a real hard realization we've come to over the past 12 months as well, that we really need to start within where people care. And the route to getting 1 billion or 2 billion people using blockchain technology is via this passive least resistance, or we think about it as the lizard brain. Like, don't make people wake up and make a decision. Just give them something that's objectively, viscerally better, and they'll just sort of lizard their way over to it. And that's really kind of how we're thinking about the evolution of this type of technology. But specifically to your point on the video conferencing side, I mean, it's a great question. Like, we use something called Jitsi Meet, which is entirely housed within a browser. It's open source. You can see what's actually happening on the back end. It's relatively functional. You can share your screen and blah, blah, blah. There's no accounts based, so everybody shows up as like a fellow Jitser. And that's, it is kind of what it is. You can add your name, but it's based on your cookie profile. So if you have a private browser, it doesn't save. So it has its shortcomings, but it's also free. So is it supported by donations? I mean, it has a parent company called EGHT, I think, that was on my list of stocks to look into for who's going to be the winner out of this. But I don't understand its business model right now. And generally, that's not a good thing to have as a publicly traded company. So I don't know exactly what the answer is for how we evolve that paradigm. In general, my thinking is, and I wrote an article on this about how Facebook could potentially sort of evolve their paradigm when they were first starting to look at having a crypto coin. Of this idea of not, because originally everybody thought, okay, we'll get users to pay 99 cents and then we'll have this like relatively straightforward pay for thing model. And for better or for worse, and I don't think anybody's retested that hypothesis, the willingness to pay from a consumer perspective is effectively zero. So can you make, and some of that's driven by like, I don't want to connect a credit card into my Apple store and do this and do that. I don't think it's actually the like, I'm not willing to pay $1 for this. It's the steps that are required to actually go. And generally the fact that there's always a free alternative and that you don't know what's happening behind the scenes or why it's free or any of that stuff. But I think if there is an ability to, and this is what we had written about for Facebook, essentially plow value and things that make Facebook valuable, likes, shares, content posting, like those types of things that actually make Facebook a valuable platform and encourage users to come back to show them advertisements and to create the sort of the secondary value. You need to have the primary value for a user before you can have valuable data on the back end. And that's a whole nother dynamics of platform that's messed up and needs to be edited as well. But if you can figure out a way to work, whether it's crypto coins or whether it's some other kind of rewards mechanism, to reward behaviors on a platform that are valuable, then to reward behaviors on a platform that are actually valuable, and instead allow those users to accumulate crypto or accumulate whatever that is. Allow Facebook potentially even to run a basic version of their business model on the back end, and then allow you to buy your privacy if you actually want to opt out of the ultimate surveillance game. Allow you to still use that platform, but pay for it with value back to the actual platform itself. I mean, even better than that would be Facebook setting itself up as a marketplace by which the advertisers that are right now interfacing with Facebook look through Facebook and actually interact with you instead. And that's a whole different model of advertising in general that we've spent some time looking into and are working with a really interesting project in India to try and get our heads around. This idea of all of the data that drives personalized advertising and real-time bidding, and all of the cost per minute or cost per milli rather, cost per click, all of those types of advertising metrics. They're all sort of held within a centralized repository right now, and the user just sees an ad and says, oh, that's weird, I said something about that a week ago. But that's, again, is a $1 trillion industry, and all of that value is stopping short. So can we build platforms instead by which the user with this 360-degree profile actually goes out to the real-time bidding market and says, here's my profile, the 50 cents you would have paid a 5% identified version of me to show me something that may be relevant to me based on a third-party cookie profile. How about you pay me $6 instead? And here's, because you know that I'm actually that person that you're trying to target. Maybe I'll buy it, maybe I won't. Or even further down the line from that, I stand up and say, I am looking to buy a flight to Milan right now on business class. Who's willing to show me that ad? It's sort of taking out the guesswork and the reason that cost per CPMs are in many cases so low right now, because there's so much unknowns around getting from that click into the actual transaction at the end. If you just announce yourself as being at the end already, that's massively valuable, especially in airlines, financial services, insurance. So to figuring out the platforms that allow you to connect that 360-degree profile directly with the people who are trying to reach you and fostering those deeper digital connections. So it's a super long-winded way of saying that I don't know exactly what the business model is for a video conferencing service. But in general, the idea of providing effort and value instead of direct $1 that I put on my credit card is where our heads go towards trying to change this paradigm.
I think one thing that you said before is very relevant and obvious. Like, there are so many musicians and companies and brands and all these different people that are trying to get these ads on Facebook because they screwed up their algorithm, and now like you know whatever you post will only go to like 1 or 2% of your audience, and then of them it's like you get 1% of the people that see it to actually engage with it, which is why you have like these pages with like millions of fans and they get like 1,000 likes on a post, and you're like, that's really weird. Or even less, like a couple of hundred, and it's like, is anybody even seeing this stuff? But I think that's one reason why the Facebook advertising is so lucrative for them and why so many people engage with it, is because you don't have to put in any payment information. You just give them permission to take money out of your bank account for like several days, whatever. Like, you set the like daily spend amount or whatever, and how many days you want to do it. You're like, yeah, I'll spend $5 a day for the next 2 weeks on this. And then, I think that's one reason, like you said, nobody wants to pay for any of this stuff. But if it was just sort of an automatic way of doing it, I think a lot more people would care about it, because people spend a lot of money on Facebook advertising, which has very, unreliable results.
Yeah, totally.
I don't think they would pay for it if they had to actually like check out. Obviously, Facebook knows that. That's why they make billions of dollars on ads. But anyway.
No, I totally agree with you. And even those Facebook results that are mediocre, that's the gold standard right now. I mean, maybe Google is probably a little bit better, but Facebook essentially is the premier data broker and theoretically has the best digital personas and the best digital profiles of us in the world. And I would say Google's probably a bit better. But to your point that it's like I have 1 million people and it's showing to 1 million, and I get 1,000 actual responses out of it. I mean, that's terrible. Like that's really bad. And of those responses, how many of those are bots as well? They're Facebook and,
right.
and YouTube especially are really bad at disguising not disguising, but detecting and defending against ad fraud. And there's billions of dollars that goes to wasted advertisements, both from, I mean, the more direct, easy to see ones are fraudulent clicks and fraudulent bot-driven ads. But the other ones are just the algorithm. It's not that good. So you saw somebody who were like, oh, I wanted a flight a week ago, but I bought it already. So next. Or just like, that's completely irrelevant to me. I don't care.
Yeah, like why are they always showing us ads for stuff that we did the week before?
So the thing from that is that, and it's I feel like we sometimes overrate the intelligence of some of these systems on the back end. I mean,
I'm sure.
And I do think that, I mean, Google has very, very top quality data scientists, and Facebook does as well. But once you get outside that, it's a very rudimentary system. I mean, the third-party cookie regime and the retargeting regime is literally like, hey, you search for this. So now when you're over here, your browser has tagged that you search for this. So now you're on this website. It's like, let's show them that. Yeah, let's show them that. And there's very limited correlation around like, okay, well, I'm actually the same person that's now on my phone. Those don't talk to each other at all. If you're using most browsers today, then they're blocking third-party cookies, and so that sort of limits what there is there. But when I was talking before about the CPMs and the willingness to pay to reach people outside of the Google and Facebook platform, I mean, the data profile that you're getting on those types of people is incredibly skinny. I mean, it's sometimes it's better, but that's really why Google and Facebook are some of the most powerful companies in the world, because they're the ones who actually have this permanent, more correlated record of you, instead of the New York Times that just has, okay, well, in this browsing session, where did you come from before? And that's all I know about you. Here's this advertising space that I have. Let's throw that third-party data profile out to that. And somebody who, let's say a flight offerer wants to meet or wants to reach people who have just Googled flights. And that's literally the extent of the smartness of that transaction. But they'll pay 50 cents for, just to put it on New York Times in general, they'll pay $7 to get it in front of somebody who's Googled a flight before. So like there's this incredible value discrepancy in even that basic level of targeting. So if you come in with this 360-degree profile, it's like, here's everything I've ever done. You don't actually even need to share it with those people. But again, this is where there's more technology required to build these linkages. But a flight provider, the willingness to pay to reach you, when instead of just like, oh, they Googled a flight once, they know everything about your location geographics within a private paradigm, is not $7, it's $70 or $75. And whether that's split within a platform or the technology that's building that, a lot of that flows back to you. So when you hear the data metrics of your personal data is worth $6-7 a month or whatever those low numbers are, sure, if you're just like, here's my raw information, go and try and build algorithms based on me and a million other people like me. But these very, very targeted ways of working within the real-time bidding system and within the existing advertising regime, there's a ton of value in there to be shared. And that's real money that, especially in a time when we're locked in our houses and a lot of us don't have ways to earn income right now, that's a real, incredibly valuable piece of income potentially. So there's a bunch of interesting factors in play around how that advertising market works. And just one more final point on that. I think one of the most interesting articles in a while came out before COVID, that Google was announcing on Chrome that they're blocking third-party trackers. And everybody's like, bravo, yes, this is a good mark for privacy. Google's finally getting in line. Brave's done this. But essentially what they're doing is they're just saying like, no, now we're destroying any external source of data. Now it's only us. We're the only people who have correlational data at all. Like third-party trackers aren't good. They're exploitative. They're behind the scenes. They're sneaky, blah, blah, blah. But at least they're decentralized or distributed to a certain extent. They allow people who don't have this massive data empire to at least have some kind of way of targeting or some kind of way of playing in that game. And by killing that, you are really killing that. So what we're looking at is, I'll explain it very briefly, what this kind of system that we're trying to build. It's effectively a router that lives in the household, and all of the data that goes through that, so everything that you're doing within that house, accrues to this virtual digital persona of yourself. And then we're looking at ways to take that digital ID and essentially look at when the third-party cookie profile would be used to send out and target and tailor ads, replacing it or having an interface with our profile instead that sends out, and then essentially rev sharing that incremental bit of revenue that comes back from the advertiser or from the real-time bidders with the people who are building that. And so some of it goes to the user, some of it goes to the technology providers that are building, but it's because it's based out of a router that is something that you just need in your house and something that you don't think twice about. It's this very, very low invasiveness, high lizard brain approach to get 15 or 20, 25 million users. If you can work with some of the existing ISPs to essentially have them roll it out. So there's these ways to kind of play with the existing fundamentals and the existing frameworks that we have to start sort of changing that paradigm behind the scenes. And again, sorry, I know I've said the last point like 3 times now. Back to the idea of changing the paradigm behind the scenes. One of my favorite stories is Sunil Sharma, who runs Singularity University, if you guys are familiar with that. He tells a story all the time about driving from Florida back to Toronto. And so he drove from Florida to Toronto in a Tesla and drove about 10% of the time on autopilot on the way up. Stayed in Toronto for, I think it was 3 or 4 months, and then drove from Toronto back to Florida 3 or 4 months later. And the upgrades that Tesla had made just behind the scenes, he drove like 35% of the way home on autopilot. So I was just like, oh, cool. This is just better now. Of course, I'll go and use whatever the hell you guys were doing back there. And this idea of just sort of behind the scenes upgrading into getting better and better and better and helping you solve your own data paradigm problems is really where I think we're going to need to get to actually make progress on the challenges that we're facing today.
Well, okay. So I love the idea that the solution can come in the hardware level. The idea that it's the router. It reminds me of Eben Moglen and his wall wart idea. Eben Moglen, the freedom in the cloud guy.
I don't think so. No.
Oh, okay. I posted a YouTube on the chat, but
nice. I'll check it out.
Back in 2010, he did this speech about identity and freedom, and he identified the solution being a piece of hardware that you have to plug into the wall, and it's a router, and it's also your identity. So you carry it with you. So it's something that requires electricity. It connects to the internet, and you bring it with you wherever you go. And so that was his way of kind of trying to find the answer.
Yeah. No, it's exactly right. It's something that, I mean, there's obviously the replaceability and the fragility of hardware to consider within that. But I mean, like the extension of what we were trying to do is, okay, then the profile that you generate on your router moves into your phone, lives at the edge. So there's, again, engineering and technology that needs to be done with that. But when you take that into a convenience store, the convenience store orients itself around you. It shows you what you think, what you will need to know. It price discriminates based on you. Like it actually does what you want a digital website to do, to show you the best content, give you the best offers that's tailored for you, to start taking that into a physical space. And we've had some really interesting longer term conversations with some physical space proprietors of how to build that. But that's essentially what Amazon does in a closed loop space within their Go stores. But it's all, again, it's these silos. And I think the one thing we've conclusively proven over and over again in technology is that silos are a great way to start, but they almost always get destroyed by open source, and they almost always get destroyed by distributed. So it's that kind of idea that we're really focused on and looking at today of how do we make this distributed and reorient the value back into the person who's creating it, us, rather than the systems that we're interacting with.
Yeah. Oh, hey, can I grab another quote from you?
Sure.
It's kind of long, but not super long. So there was a YouTube video that I watched you participate in, and at the end of it, the interviewer asks the most difficult question of all: what's the world going to be like in 10 years? And your response was just awesome. It was super inspiring. And if I could just kind of read back, I kind of jotted it down.
Sure.
And maybe that would kind of conjure up some more discussion. So the question was, what do you see happening in 10 years? And you kind of gave your utopian version. So here goes. We're wonderful as individuals, but when we start acting en masse, we start to make suboptimal decisions as a giant unit. So I think where a lot of this tech is going to, it's to inject humanity into a giant computer, that version of our society that's optimized for making humans happy and feel good. We're starting to understand some of that. If we keep going with the current surveillance capitalism version of the world, we're essentially going to end up with all these impulses used against us that make things valuable to commercial enterprises. With this type of tech, when we can start having our own personal data vaults, our own personalized AI, our own self-sovereignty, when we can choose what we want to share without losing the personalization and customization that marks the hallmark of the evolution of Web 2.0, so far I think we can start actually pouring more and more of our data, our habits, our thoughts, our emotions, our physical well-being, all of that into something that has a 360-degree digitized view of us, and then start actually optimizing on a better way than trying to filter through all of our idiotic impulses and trying to make the best decisions we can right now. So I think that in 10 to 15 years down the line, we're going to have unbelievably advanced, digitized, optimized versions of ourselves that are actually going to be our digital avatars. So when I was talking about the exponential increase in commerce, that's obviously not slowing. But I don't think that's going to be us as individuals who are wading through all of that and wading through all the algorithms that are essentially trying to push in different directions. It's going to be digitized versions of ourselves, whether it's conversationally controlled, whether it's happening at a machine speed, whatever the actual implementation of that is, they're going to be empowered to transact via blockchain. They're going to have digitized wallets. They're going to be able to do commerce and negotiations exponentially faster than we can, with exponentially more information that can get to optimal outcomes, so that we as humans just can't get to individually. So overall, we will end up with an optimized society that's far more inclusive, less bias driven. We won't have financial exclusion, because essentially we'll have fixed all the infrastructure at 1 cent or half a cent transactions that can happen for us. Today we have trillions in capital. We need to interact in $10, $20, $50 increments to make it worthwhile, but we won't see all of that. That'll be behind the scenes. Hopefully we'll have something that's optimizing for all of us at the individual level that makes us happy. It won't be dollars, because that's a proxy for happiness. It'll be something deeper. So philosophy is probably going to be the skill set that will dominate over the next 10 years, because those are the algorithms that you're trying to maximize now. It isn't money. It's something better. So I just have to say 2 words to that. A fucking man.
Thanks, man. I've never had it read back to me. It's optimized way too much and exponentially. But no, I appreciate that, man. It was a somewhat off the cuff answer, but it's something that I've written and thought about for a long time. We're actually pulling together a Git book right now that essentially is what do we need to do from today to get to there? What are all the paradigms? What are all the challenges? What is COVID forcing forward? And what is all this stuff together kind of in a drawn out real narrative that get us to that spot? And I think a big part of it, and something that I've somewhat shied away from talking about a ton because it's relatively controversial and there's not really great answers for it yet, is this reorientation away from shareholder value maximization, which we kind of created as a construct in the 70s that, okay, well, we don't know how to make our managers act right. So let's assume that money is always equal to right because it's calculable. And if you're doing something that maximizes the shareholder value, then you're generally doing it right. And I think we've kind of adopted that mantra across all of our individual lives and operations, the way our governments work, the way our countries work as friends and rivals of each other, because it's always been the only source of calculable, definable truth. It's easy to optimize money. It's very, very hard to optimize happiness or well-being or connectivity or any of these other sort of alternative, softer goals. But we're getting towards technology now that we can start doing that. We have Fitbits that monitor heart rates. We have EKGs that can tell when we're happy and what we're feeling. And one of the points I was getting at there is that if we don't fix this underlying paradigm of us cruising along in this top 10% and having no idea what's happening behind the scenes, all of that type of technology is going to start to be manipulated and used against us by the, not to overly demonize these guys, but the Googles and Facebooks of the world. Because the models they build today are accurate to a certain point, but Nora was mentioning before that the Facebook models aren't that great. But if Facebook can leverage a bunch of stuff to force me to do something, or to leverage my cognitive biases against me to be scared and know that when I'm scared I'm going to run over here, then their models get that much more valuable. And when we were talking before about 50 cents to $7 to $70, well, now Facebook can earn that $7 because they're like, hey, well, I can push this person over here by doing this thing. So this idea of both that we're starting to have the technology to be able to optimize and understand people as physical individual units instead of as a dollar sign, which gives us this really interesting opportunity to reorganize a society around optimizing en masse for something other than dollars. And that's what that actually looks like on a day-to-day basis is very, very philosophical in nature. What are we trying to maximize for? What are the technologies that can manage that? What do corporate structures look like in that world? What does joblessness look like in that world? Should we be optimizing for unemployment rate even right now? Is there better things to do that would make people more happy than earning minimum wage jobs that are now extremely dangerous in the physical world? And so the sort of the most advanced science on it, I guess, right now is stakeholder maximization instead of shareholder maximization. And that's like a little bit of an evolution forward on it. I think we need to, as a society, get even farther down the line. But what do we maximize for? And who makes that decision? And can we leverage AI to potentially help us make those decisions about what we're maximizing for? And all of this stuff, back to kind of the original thread, is driven by we as individual meat computers and lizards right now operating in this hyper machine speed world. We're at a massive disadvantage. And a lot of it's driven by the concept of shareholder value maximization, where the companies are incented to manipulate us to do more predictable things and be more predictable and buy more things, and because that's the way our system's oriented. So at the very least, if we can have a robust data set that is us, that is all of our history, all of our emotions, stuff that we've checked and we've validated and we make sure is right, and we're willing to do that because it's the machine speed version of us that's out there avoiding echo chambers, recommending content for us that it knows is good for us in some other paradigm of maximizing happiness, is sort of defending the existing social media ideas of what's out there, is getting the right products, is doing the negotiations, is filtering through the 10 different various versions of what's out there right now for different products. It's essentially doing all of the things that are happening in that 90% that we can't see, but on our behalf and with a human forward integrity and with a supply chain, for lack of a better word, where we can see why it's doing something, why it's working this way, why we're getting this recommendation, and essentially be able to audit and consistently improve this digital version of ourselves. So I don't know if you guys know Ray Dalio. He wrote an amazing book called Principles a few years ago. Runs a hedge fund, but don't hold that against him. He's an amazing thinker. And he, back in the 80s, essentially decided to create like every piece of data that they have goes into this master model. And then every decision that they make it based on what they think they should do from a human perspective. And then they test it based against this model that they're constantly adding data to, constantly updating. And then they look at the answers. And they say, okay, well, what's right? Why are we different? Why are we thinking differently than our model? Do we need to update our model? Or is this some lizard brain bias that we just didn't even see, that the cold rational numbers over here have helped us adjust for? And so, and I think that idea of this constantly running, completely clean version of our mental operating system, even running in parallel beside us when we're making decisions and saying like, oh, hey, that's a bias that you're not recognizing. I think there's so much room for improvements in the way we interact with each other. There's so much room for improvement in the way we consume content, the way we have digital representation and digital interactions. And especially, if, let's assume the worst, and we're stuck in lockdown for a long, long, long time, and we actually get to develop these things, those are going to be the secure ways to actually have real high value digital interactions in a completely decentralized and disconnected world. So there's a whole bunch of pieces of technology that go into that, but I'm very comfortable in saying that I think it's going to be philosophy that drives the next stage of evolution of what we need to organize our society around.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Well, we're starting to reach the top of the hour now. Does anybody else have stuff to talk about?
Oh, awesome. Well, thanks a lot for having me, guys. This has been super interesting. I'm always happy to talk through this stuff. I think it runs through my brain on a 24-hour loop, so I'm always happy to have other people to go back and forth on this with.
Yeah, we really appreciate you joining us as well, and we're going to post this, so I wonder if it'll get anybody in our community interested in your work, or, you know, I mean, just when you post conversations, you just don't know exactly what's going to happen, but I think personally, you've raised a lot of points that I haven't thought of yet, so anyway, I think it'll be really great for our community to watch it, and so we really appreciate you sharing your knowledge.
Absolutely. No problem. And if anybody wants to reach out, I can't say I'm always available, but I love having these conversations and love diving deep into this stuff. The book is going to be called The Lizard and the Machine, Maintaining Human Integrity in a Machine Speed World. So when it's up around, then I'll flip you guys the link.
Yeah, we reach you through Bicameral Ventures website and the GitHub repo that you were referring to. Do you have is that repo private or?
The Git book? It's not up yet. This is a new thing, but there's one that's very similar by Albert Wenger called World After Capital. That's sort of the completely different content, but that's sort of the idea that I'm going for. I want it to be a living thing. I want to get feedback. I want to have co-authors. I want to have this whole thing isn't going to be solved by me or my crew of people who are within my circle. It's going to be solved by all of us solving a whole bunch of different points in a bunch of different ways, including you guys.
Right on.
Well, awesome. We'll definitely look out for all that stuff. And should I do the outro? Is that what we're doing now?
Yes, please.
Do it, Nora.
Okay, great. Okay, so thank you everybody for joining our climate and coordination, mostly coordination today. RCAST, if you'd like to become a member of RChain, you can do that at rchain.coop. If you would like to subscribe on YouTube, that would be great because we'll put out more videos. And if you would like to be a guest on this call, you can email Daryl or myself at climate@rchain.coop. So we'll see you there, and thank you, everyone.
Awesome.
Thank you
very much, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Cheers.